Hi, it's Lou, welcome to my channel, and today I've got a watercolour project that I've been really enjoying working on. The series I'm currently working on is all about landscape, and it's about creating work that's abstract, but it comes from or is inspired by landscapes, real or imagined. And like the work I shared a couple of weeks ago, this one is inspired by just an offhand comment in a book that I've been reading called The Old Ways by Robert Macfarlane. In it he talks about walking different types of paths. In landscape sometimes you can really see a big wide flat horizon, but actually a lot of the time it's obscured by trees, buildings, other features of the landscape. So we rely on these man-made features, paths, way markers, cairns, to find our way forward. And in the book that I was reading, he talks about paths and shapes that you find in these landscapes, and talks about the S-curve, or the Ogee, christened by William Hogarth. And that sent me down a little bit of a rabbit hole exploring this S-curve shape, which Hogarth called the line of beauty. And so in today's project, that's the shape that I'm exploring, that S-curve shape. So I want to create a piece of art today that's got that S-curve at the heart of it, that's the focal point. So I've got my sketchbook out and I'm just going to draw some ideas. I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I know that I want the S-curve to be the focal point, so I'm going to start with that. So I draw a diagonal line across the page and then roughly work out where the centre is. And then I know I want a curve that goes one way above the line and then a different way below the line. So I'm going to need a point kind of the same distance out from that central point. Could be anything. I decide 6 centimetres is about right for the scale that I'm working on. And I just make a point on that diagonal line 6 centimetres away from that central point. And then those points where they cross that line, those are the centres of the arcs that I can use to draw the S-curve. So one line above the diagonal and one line below. So you get a curve going one way and then it switches at the centre and then goes the other way. So that's the basic S-curve, but I want mine to have a little bit of width. So I just make my compasses a little bit bigger and then use the same points but to draw 2 separate arcs. Now I've got 2 lines that don't meet in the middle. I need to make my compasses smaller in order to kind of make those lines meet. And again I make the same lines above and below that centre point. So there's my S-curve. Now I've just got to decide what I'm going to do with the rest of the page. I decide that as a starting point I'll draw some circles. I'll continue those curving lines outwards, both the top right and the bottom left hand side of the page. And I make the small circle and the big circle, changing the sizes of my compasses in between. And I decide that I want something in the top left and the bottom right hand corner as well to balance it all out. So I need to make the diagonal in the other direction. And I do that by putting the point of my compasses back on those marks, increasing the size of my compasses so they're over halfway, making a little arc, and then joining that arc through the centre and out the other side. I move my compasses back to that 6 centimetres, the one I had originally, so that I can put the point of the compass on the centre and mark how far that is up and down that second diagonal line. Then I can use those points as the centres for the new circles. And at this point I make a mistake, which I'll discover later, which is that I didn't use the right point as the centre of my circle. So I ended up with a bigger gap between those 2 circles than I really wanted. and they should overlap in the middle, and then at this point I'm surprised when they don't. So I have to spend a little bit of time working out what I did wrong and go back and fix it. I realised that having carefully measured 6 centimetres out from the centre, I didn't actually use that as the centre point for those lots of circles. So I just needed to erase them and start again. That's one of the benefits of doing this in a sketchbook first. So you get to make all those mistakes the first time round, and hopefully you won't make them again. Okay, so I've filled the page. I do feel like if I just painted it as it is, it might be a little dull. It needs something asymmetric in it, so I need to do something different on the right and the left hand side, I think. So I decided to square off the right hand side. So just place my ruler so they're just touching both circles, and then draw it along to the right. That gives me a little bit of an asymmetric shape, so I can do something different on the right than on the left. And I just put in a few extra lines as guidelines that I might use or I might not. I decide that the shape on the right will look good as one shape rather than two. I'll just remove a few lines from within my sketch just to give me an idea of what this is going to look like. I really want the S-curve to be prominent. So on my sketch I just sketch it in, add a little bit of colouring just to make it really obvious where that's going to be, where it's going to be really prominent. And then I'm ready to transfer this onto watercolour paper. So I have done exactly the same sketch on the watercolour paper. The only difference here is I decided I want a skinnier S-curve, so I made my circles a little bit closer together. And then I'm just starting, I've made the pencil lines quite light on my painting because I want them to disappear under the watercolour. I don't want to see them at all. But I do want to see where this S-curve is. So I decide that that's the first thing I'm going to paint. I'm going to paint over it, but if I paint it in first and give it a layer of colour, then I should be able to see it a little bit better when I've painted those layers over it. I'm using indigo paint, and I'm going to use pretty much one colour of paint for this. Now to tackle those geometric shapes one at a time. And for the first one, I'm laying down a nice kind of wash of just plain water. It's quite tricky to see where the edges are. So you can see my head gets in the way sometimes, because I'm really trying to keep close to my pencil lines and make sure that I'm not overshooting the shape with the water. And then once we're all completely saturated and every little bit of this area is wet, then I drop some really quite concentrated indigo watercolour paint into it and swirl it around. I think I want this area to be quite dark, and I want the patterns in it to be fairly random, just from the way that the watercolour has moved and flowed. So I just keep adding extra water to add movement to the paint, and extra pigment to make sure it stays nice and dark. I do know it's going to dry later, but the more pigment I can add at this point, the better. I know it's going to take a good while for that shape to dry. So I did it at the end of the day, and I could come back to this painting the next day and have everything completely dry and ready to go. I can see that my first shape has dried with some interesting marks in it, due to where the paper has buckled under the weight of all that water. And I want to do a similar thing with this second shape. I'm combining the top circle with a rectangle that I drew that incorporates that S-curve to the left-hand side of it. This time, rather than painting it all with water, I'm painting it with light wash of indigo. I want this section to be lighter, and I know I'm going to want to layer something over the top of it. So I just want to create not an even coverage of paint. I'm quite happy if some areas are darker and some are a little bit lighter, but I don't really want to get any hard lines in there. So I'm moving around, trying to make sure that I keep all the wet edges still wet, and using the point of my brush to get right into the corners. So I want to have kind of dark, medium and light areas in this painting. So I'm going over my extra circle again with another layer of light paint. I'm using the same colour all the time, indigo. I'm using it because I like the colour, but also because I know that I can get it really dark, and I can also add lots of water to it, make it really dilute, and get a real range of tones with that one shade. And as I paint, I'm using the edge of the S-curve that I painted in first as my kind of boundary on that side, and that makes it really useful. I'm really glad I painted that in, otherwise it would have been really difficult to see where that S-curve shape ended. Just as it's going to be quite difficult here to see where the pencil line sits underneath that dark layer of indigo I put down on the first circle. Now I did say I wanted to do layering as part of this piece. It's going to be really simple structurally. Just those two circles and that shape that's kind of defined by the S-curve on the left-hand side. So I want to increase depth in some areas, and I want some areas of texture to add interest to the piece because the shapes are so simple. I'm using that technique of creating a wash of water first. And I'm putting it down on top of the first layer of this odd shape that I painted. Just like I did with the first circle, I'm dropping some really concentrated paint into my entirely wet shape. You should be able to see the gleam of the water on the surface there through the lights. So you can see how wet it is. It's so wet, I've spilt some on my table and I've got my arm in it. And I'm just dropping in patches of colour. Where I'm going around the edges, I'm using the tip of my brush to kind of smooth them out. Because I find that when I do this technique, often the paint will run to the edge, but it will leave a kind of, like a wobbly, indistinct line and if I want a really clear, strong one, I need to kind of go back in and fix it a bit. Start adding a little bit of Payne's grey in, to create a little bit of variation, not a huge amount. Oh, and I've just gone over the edge of my wet area. So I can use a bit of paper towel to blot that up and hopefully restore my nice crisp edge. So once I've got enough paint in there in patches, I'm going to add some salt to create texture in those very wet areas. This is quite fine salt, so the texture should be kind of fairly subtle, I think. You should just see little kind of points of darkness where the pigment collects around the salt crystals. So I've got my dark area, my medium area and my light area, but I decided that the light area is still a little too light, so I want to do some layering on here as well. But again, I'm using that kind of wash of quite pale dilute paint to make the layer on this side much more subtle. So I said I was particularly interested in this idea of the line of beauty, this S-curve shape. And I particularly picked up on it because of my kind of musings on horizons and paths, I think. And I've been thinking about kind of the way forward in art, in life, as a kind of more of an unknown than a grand wide horizon. And so this idea of the S-curve, the path that's kind of stretching off into the future, and you can just about see around the next corner, but you can't see any further than that. That seems particularly apt for the way that I understand kind of the art process, but also kind of life in general. It's probably a bit trite, but you really don't know what's coming around the next corner. And so as I wanted to make this piece, I knew I wanted the S-curve to be prominent, but I didn't really know what else I wanted. And so the whole thing became an experiment, a kind of a step by step by step, not planned out in advance, but having one idea and that idea leading to the next and to the next and to the next. At this point my painting could have been finished, but I knew that I wanted something else, and I decided to add some gold leaf to really highlight that S-curve. I could have just used some gold paint, but I've been enjoying playing with gold leaf recently, so I decided to create a masking fluid outline of the shape that I want to gold leaf. I'm using a pair of compasses that have a ruling end. Now I've used these before a few times, and sometimes they've worked really well, and then sometimes I've really struggled with them, and today was a bit of a struggle. Sometimes I got a really smooth line, sometimes I got nothing at all, sometimes I got a bit of a blob. So I think using these in a lot of paintings, well, I'd need a lot of practice first, but I think this one worked out okay. Start by floating some masking fluid in between the two kind of prongs of the ruling end, and then using that to draw a curve on the outside of that painted S curve that I've made in the centre of my painting. I'm going to need to make 4 lines, 2 small circles and 2 larger ones. And eventually, after a little bit of trial and error, some lines coming out thicker and some coming out a little thinner, I managed to draw those 4 lines with the compasses. I used a brush just to cap the ends of the S-curve and waited for the whole thing to dry. To apply the gold leaf, I use a little bit of an acrylic size, which is a glue that always stays a little bit tacky. And I could just paint this on with a small paintbrush. And theoretically, the masking fluid should make painting it on nice and easy, because I don't need to be too worried about being neat on the edges because I've already done that bit. The final step is to use some of my gold leaf. It's just a case of placing it on, letting it stick to the size, putting a little bit of pressure on it to get it to stick nice and cleanly, and filling any little gaps with some extra little bits of gold leaf. And once it's all stuck, you can take a soft brush and remove the excess. In this case, the gold leaf will also stick to the masking fluid that you put down, but that's okay, because when you remove it, it should all come off and leave a nice clean edge. I did have a couple of little bits where I think I'd overshot with some of the size, and so I've got some gold leaf stuck to the blue areas that I don't want it to be on. But a very, very light scrape with a scalpel will get rid of those. So in the end, this is the image that I've ended up with. I really like that highlighted, curving path through the centre, almost like you're looking down on a bird's eye view of path weaving between hills. I can imagine being on the path and not being able to see too far ahead or behind me, but being able to trust in the path and knowing it'll carry me forwards. I enjoyed this image so much that I decided to make a screen print of it. I've really only just finished this. I'm really quite happy with it, and I've just got a couple of tiny shots of it. I didn't film making this, but maybe I'll film another screen print very shortly. So thanks very much for watching today. I really hope that you've enjoyed this. I'd really like it if you wanted to have a go at this project, but I'd also really like to see where the concept of the S-curve takes you. So thanks, take care, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.